and I work at the University of Nanterre, more precisely at the Laboratoire d'Ethnologie and Sociologie Comparative, so the one anthropology lab of the CNRS, which is the French National Research Institute.
Okay, thank you. I am Bernd Mori, and I was trained as a musicologist, and I'm doing also anthropology. And I've been working mainly for a couple of years with indigenous people in the Amazon lowlands, in the Western Amazon in Peru. And I'm now living and working in Graz in Austria at the Center for Systematic Musicology, which includes psychology and cognition of music and so on. And okay, so I'm trying to start now our talk, and I'm going to try to share the screen. I shared the screen. Can you see?
Yes.
The postures of listening and vocal agencies. Okay, this is now a talk we prepared, which will last for, I hope, the maximum of 1 hour. And the whole thing is about what Victor and I have been thinking about for a couple of years now, for 10 years already. And so we published a paper, which we also sent and linked, maybe you saw it, with a debate in it. And we are still going on thinking about how listening works and what listening is. So it's not definitive. So we are looking forward to your criticisms, suggestions, questions, and so on. The contents will be that we are going to do a kind of double conference and talk about certain topics. First, I'm going to give an outline to what we call the postures of listening, and that will go on to why do we depart from concepts like language and music, give some example of the voice, singing voices, and then ask a question, why do we alternatives, our postures of listening are alternatives, 3 alternative postures. I'm going to explain them in a minute. And why are these alternatives important? And how are those different postures suggested by different means? And finally, concluding, talk about technologies to target this listening. Down there you can see the reference to the paper we wrote. You can find it online. So what about those 3 postures of listening? When we are listening, we are working with our ears mainly. However, there are other senses involved. But we're not going so much into the physiological process of listening, but into a more phenomenological inquiry about what do we actually hear as human listeners. Yeah. So we decided that that's a proposition now, a proposal, that there are 3 modes of listening. And the first one we call indexical listening. This is a kind of the default mode of listening. So we hear some sound and we connect this sound to its source, which can be an object or an event in the outer world. The outer world is the space we construct by combining our visual and auditory and tactile information and so on. So it's a world we project outside. Usually, if there is a tree and there's a bird in the tree and the bird makes a sound, so I can hear the sound and I infer the existence of a bird up in the tree. Yeah. So I infer the source of the sound from listening. I can infer its existence, so to say there's a bird, but also I can maybe, if I learned it, identify the bird. This is a blackbird, for example. And with the birds I have difficulties, but with humans, for example, I can also infer the inner state of this being. Like, for example, I hear the voice of Matthias Levy, who is present here, and I know him, so I can identify that it's a human over there talking, and I can identify this human being as Matthias Levy. And if he's very angry, then I can also hear that his inner state, that he's angry or happy or sad or whatever. And I locate this object, this source of the sound, as I said, in a space which overlaps with the space I construct with other sensory domains. And when we hear these sounds in this way, small variations can be of very important. As I mentioned, for example, when inferring the inner state, somebody being angry or happy or something, or ironic, there are sometimes very fine-grained distinctions that allow to infer the inner state of a being. This is one way of listening. You can listen to any sound in that way. The second one is structural listening, which you can actually also employ for any kind of sound. What we infer from these sounds is an abstract content. So the most obvious example is when you listen to somebody talking in a language that you understand, like you're now listening to me, I hope, with all your awareness. And you do not usually try to connect the voice you hear to me as a person and where I am and whatever. This is rather unimportant if you listen to what I am saying. Yeah. So we have sounds that we correlate with oppositional meanings. This is what in structuralism, in linguistic structuralism, was called double articulation, for example. So I gave this example here, cat or cut. I say cat, and you can understand that I mean cat, but you don't link this sound to a specific cat. This would be like meow, and you say, oh, there's a cat over there. This is indexical listening. Yes, but if I say cat and you understand cat as any cat in the world, then you understand what I say, but this is not exactly the sound. It's the morpheme, which is connected to the sound, to the phoneme you hear when you listen to my voice. And usually fine-grained distinctions are not very relevant. I can say cat, and it's still the cat. And if I say, for example, cut, then it's something different. But you will either hear cat or cut. There is no in between. You can't hear both things at the same time. There's either one or the other, or you don't understand anything. Yeah? So either one or the other. And this is obvious in listening to language, but it's also, you can apply it, for example, when you listen to sounds in a concert hall and they play major, minor tonal progressions, and so you can understand now comes the variation and whatever the motive X, and you can identify it as a D minor piece or something. So you decode the structure behind it. Yeah, like in language, there's an abstract meaning behind it. We'll have some example later. The final listening posture is called enchanted listening, and we infer objects from like emotions, agencies, sonic beings, we call it sonic beings, that are in the sonic domain. The important thing is that the location in space is in an independent auditory space. It's a kind of exclusively auditory realm. For example, if you have a melody going up like da 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 da, as I'm singing da 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 da, yeah, and I'm not moving upwards, but you can perceive an upward movement, and the place where you perceive this upward movement is the auditory space. This does not overlap, or usually, or sometimes in part, with the space, this outer space we construct with visual, auditory, and other means. And it's an exclusively auditory realm. And within this realm, we'll have like relations between different sounds, things like tension and release in what we call music. And we have the impression that one sound or one tone occurs because of another one, because there's a tension build up and this has to be released. So we build up causalities that exist inside this sonic domain, yeah, and do not overlap with the space outside. And also we have variations, small things that can change things very much. So I think this is a raw outline. And yeah, it is important that you can employ the three modes of listening to any kinds of sounds. Yeah. We'll give you some examples and we can debate on that and so on, but you can, it's not a distinction between ecological listening to the environment, listening to language and listening to music, but it's three postures of listening that you can employ to any kind of sound. Also, maybe there are some suggestions to employ this or that mode. Okay, Victor, please.
Yeah, thank you, Bernd. I must say it's always difficult to explain this, what we mean with the theory, because first of all, it's a general kind of theory is always a bit risky or a bit awkward in a way, like to say things in general university are like that. There are reasons why we try to do this. We explain them in the paper. Maybe it's not worth beginning with this now, but we can have that in the discussion. Why do we need a theory of listening? After all, there have been so many of them already. And the other difficult point sometimes is that depending on the people we talk to, whether they are musicians, ethnomusicologists, people, researchers in cognitive science, so they have very different backgrounds regarding sound, very different expectations also regarding what should be a theory of listening. So I hope that that at the end of the talk you'll get the general picture of the thing. Now I will focus on why I think it's important to not have a theory of how we listen to music or how we listen to language. Why it is useful to avoid these terms, at least for a start, because this is one of the differences perhaps between what we propose and what other theories of listening have proposed. There have been a lot of theories of how we listen to language, to music, to the sounds of the environment. As Bernd said, our theory is not about this. It's more about how do you know that something is music or language or anything else in the first place. So how do you create the ontology of of auditory experience, the things that exist in it? The reason why we have to go at that stage, well, there are twofold. There are two reasons. One is that if I take the example of music, many societies do not use this concept like we do. So this is a known problem in ethnomusicology, that people doing fieldwork in other societies do not encounter, the researchers did not encounter something that would correspond, that would translate our concept of music. For instance, in some societies, people might group the songs that are used for curing other people, they group them with the other curing techniques, with the herbs, the plants, the tools that are used for curing people. And they wouldn't think that those kind of sounds have anything to do with the sounds used for hunting, for instance, or with child songs, and so on. So the concept of music cannot be said to be universal in the sense that we find it in all human societies. Quite the contrary also, sometimes things that we would want to call musical, are definitely not musical by the standards of that society. For example, in many societies where Islam, the religion Islam, is present, there is quite a strong distinction between music on the one hand and a kind of recitation of that includes prayer, that includes the call for prayer, that would sound musical it would sound like singing for many Western ears, but it is not. Let's listen. You might have heard this kind of example already, but let's listen to an adhan, a call for prayer, by Sheikh Abdul Basit Abdul Samad from Egypt. Hopefully you will hear it, and I will cut my microphone for that.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله
Okay, I stop it. Stop it here. Well, a Western ear would want to call this singing, really, but the problem here is not that in Egypt people like the concept of music. On the contrary, there is a concept called musiki, which comes actually from the Greek, the same Greek root as the word music. But it is important that people emphasize the fact that this is not music, because music is linked with other kinds of worldly activities, not with divine inspiration. Whereas this kind of singing, it is not called singing, sorry, it is called so recitation or calling for prayer. Now, it is a kind of utterance that has a special agency that a normal speech would not have. So people know that it is not like normal speech, but it is more towards the speech side. It has an agency that is supposed to be the speaker's, to come from God, not the speaker's agency, but an agency that comes from God, from divine inspiration in more or less direct line. This is another example where, so it's awkward to use the word music because it directly contradicts what people say. And there have been also researches on showing historically how music was banned at some times in various societies. Music is banned, but this kind of vocal production goes on. So this is their anthropologists have a problem. Usually anthropologists try to explain culture to use the vocabulary of the people they work with. Now, here it is difficult because the word music is not used in all the human societies. This kind of concern is not actually insurmountable, because after all, we could define our own concepts and just use those concepts cross-culturally. It would be indeed ethnocentric, so the cultural equivalent of anachronic, but maybe there is just no other way to think about music as a shared human ability. So maybe we should, after all, we could have a definition of music and just apply it everywhere. But to go that way, I mean, that's something that people in hard sciences would say. So sometimes they say, okay, just define your concept and use it, and that's it. That's how science goes. Now, to go that way, we would want to really strong definitions, however, of the concept. And we would need to double check that those definitions are actually heuristic too. We have to be sure that the things that they bind together are really worth studying together, despite our informants telling us otherwise. And at the moment, there might be such a definition for language, so something that enables one to go in anywhere and say this is language and this is not. But for music, we don't have this. So that's one problem. Then the other problem is that even if we know the object, we don't know how a person listens to it. For example, well, one example it would be daydreaming while listening to language. Teachers know well that students can daydream while listening to a lecture. No attention is paid to what is being said. One might say, okay, but this is not listening. Daydreaming while listening to language is not really listening. Maybe. But what about daydreaming while listening to music? So I listen to music and my thoughts flow away and I don't really listen to it, or do I? It's difficult to determine. But it's definitely a different kind of listening or focusing. So then for example, attending to its harmonic structure. Another example of how people might listen differently. You attend a lecture as a student and you try to write down as much of it as you can. And that is because you have the feeling that you don't quite understand what the professor is saying. You don't quite understand the point, but you know that you should definitely work this out for your exams. So you just write it down, hoping that it will get clearer later. So you recognize the words and you focus on them, but you don't get the general meaning. Should we say that we are listening to this as language? What kind of listening is this? Or another example, you are Bela Bartok back from a trip to Transylvania. And there you have recorded some traditional dances on a wax cylinder. And now you are at your desk in Budapest and you try to transcribe those tunes. So you play them back at half speed. That's how Bartok worked. You play them back at half speed and you try to transcribe as much of the tune as you can. You know that the wax cylinder is quickly wearing out and you don't know exactly why you transcribe this. And in fact, your transcription ends up having so many tiny details and ornaments that it obscures the general tune. Let's look. So yeah, Bernd, you displayed this is a transcription by Bela Bartok. This is the tune that Bartok was transcribing.
1363-as henger.
Victor, we can't hear you.
Sorry, yes, I forgot this. Okay, so on and on the tune goes. Thank you. The tune goes on and on like this, and Bartok transcribes as much as he can from this. So he was in his writings, in his diary and so on, see that he worked for posterity, for an analysis that someone else would hopefully do one day. After he finished transcribing several hundreds of pieces like this, his next task was to arrange them somehow, so to devise a classification system. Now the question is this kind of listening, what is musical about this kind of listening? What is the common point between Bartok's way of listening to achieve this graphical representation of the tune, this very, very precise graphical representation, and the way of listening of the village people who were dancing to that tune, not while he was recording, but it was a dance tune. So did they get the same thing out of the tune? Did they all of them, of course, recognize that it is about music, but what exactly was common between one listening and the other? And I take Bartok as an example, but of course it's just an example of what happens when people listen analytically and try to transcribe music. Our own culture implements concepts of language and music which are pretty well defined. The definition may not be very easy to spell out, and it may have some edge cases and blind spots, but people raised to our culture end up with a pretty common sense of what music is and what language is. The point is that it does not follow that they listen to these things in just one way. Even if we know for a fact that people listen to music or to language according to their own standards, we can't know whether they listen to them linguistically or musically, let's say. So many theories of listening end up being prescriptive for that reason. they describe ideal listeners and ideal ways of listening. They don't care so much about the daydreaming student or about the scrupulous musicologist. And of course, the daydreaming student and the musicologist are exceptions to ways of listening which are more appropriate in presence of what our society calls speech and music. They are exceptions. Nevertheless, exceptions are interesting, and not the least because they remind us that there is inherent freedom in the act of listening. A listener is free to choose how he or she listens. So now I want to focus more on this idea of freedom. The freedom in the act of listening is twofold, maybe. One kind of freedom is related to the allocation of attention. People often get to choose which auditory streams they focus on and which ones they leave to the background. Attention has been pretty well studied experimentally. Attention has been pretty well studied experimentally, usually to the effect of showing its consequences, to evaluate, for instance, how much of the unattended background gets processed, nevertheless. But the mere fact that one can shift, a listener can shift his attention or her attention from one stream to the other demonstrates that there is some freedom, some choice in the act of listening. Not always, but sometimes. The other freedom, which we bring more specifically into discussion, is related to the way of listening. There are many ways of listening to one thing, to a tune, to a bird, to a news report. But sometimes changing the way of listening seems to change the thing itself. We get the impression that it is no longer the same thing because it has different ontological properties. It becomes an object of a different kind and it affords different kinds of interactions. In our theory, we call postures of listening these ways of listening which have ontological consequences. The posture that the listener adopts in respect to the auditory input gives the listener access to one kind of auditory world. That's the theory I'm stating. If the listener changes the posture, the kinds of things that populate the listener's world will change accordingly. This is a bit similar to the allocation of attention, but the choice here is about the mode of awareness, how we link auditory input to physical sources, to abstract patterns, or to entities that we take to exist in the sound itself. Bernd has some examples related to the voice.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, I hope so. Okay, so now we should kind of be aware that there are different ways of listening, like exemplified by Victor, and we still have a proposal of the three modes. And the three modes would create, as Victor said, objects or also subjects with different ontological properties. Like if you listen to a song, you can focus on who is singing. So you link the voice and the singing, or what you hear, to a person. So I'm going to play an example, and maybe you can find out, and maybe you can know who you actually hear, if you can hear the sound. I hope it works as always. Let's go.
Роман досі обкав'яже Катерина загиба, Грисно волина поба, на воду тяга. Ой, мама, люблю Гриця, Гриць на колику вертиться, Гриця шапка до лиця, люблю Гриця молодця.
Okay, who did recognize who sang that? Yeah, you were all muted, so, but somebody maybe has recognized the singer. The main singer is Polina herself. And so you can, of course, like if you answer the phone and somebody talks into the phone on the other side, you usually immediately recognize, if it's somebody you know, you immediately recognize who that is. And so what you connect to the voice is a person. Yes, let's say we hear Paulina singing. Yeah. And also other women are joining in. So we hear human beings, women singing. And if we are able to identify, we hear Paulina singing. And if we have very well-trained ears, we can also follow Paulina's voice after the others join in. Many people probably are not able to do that. If you know how to listen to voices, you are able to do that. So also this kind of inference you can use for identifying is a matter also of sharpening your ears. If you hear this, okay, you can identify who you hear, and this is something you do by indexical listening. You connect the sound to the sound source. It stems from a human being singing. Then you can try to listen to it in order to understand. If it's a song with lyrics, like in this case, you can understand the semantic context in case you understand the language. I don't know how many of you listening could understand what Paulina and others were actually singing. I could not. However, I can also listen to it like Bela Bartok in order to hear exactly the intervals and would imagine which notes I should write down in order to transcribe sequences of intervals and how this kind of works in a certain system which is applied in a certain genre of singing, like in that case. And this I do by structural listening. I can also listen to what is in it. So I can perceive, and this is also a very common mode for people who are not focusing on who sings or focusing on what is actually pronounced or told in the story, which can be conveyed, or in the structural properties of the melodic rhythmic sequences. That is to perceive emotions or expressions, like, as I mentioned, like tensions and releases and sonic agencies. So sounds that seem to create other sounds that follow up. And no, lost it, just let me get it again. So you have this these emotions, and for example, in that example, movement is present. Yeah, movement is something very important. I mentioned before also the tune that's going up, so it's moving upward. There is movement in this example. Usually, if you play this example, people start moving like this. People very often, many people start moving their bodies. But this is not because the sound has hands that moves bodies, but it's properties of what we hear, that we perceive movement actually, and even tend to embody this movement. The movement, however, is not in the sonic signal. It's not in the sound waves that are transmitted by loudspeakers in that case. Yeah, the movement is somewhere else. The movement is exactly something that happens in this merely auditory domain. Yeah? And this example should show that we have the choice. As Victor said, we can choose. Maybe there's a kind of default way that first, like, who is singing? There are some women singing or something. And then can I understand the lyrics? Can I understand the structures? And then kind of get into the emotion. I can do this in that way, or I can stick with one mode, or I can start already with the third mode, or whatever. So also there is maybe we don't really choose consciously what to do now, but we do choose how to listen to an example like this. Okay, then let's go speed up.
Yeah.
I hand over to Victor again.
Are we late already? Because I thought Yeah, yes, maybe we're late a little bit. Maybe just to add one thing to what Bernd just said, but with the example of the voice. In a way, it's nothing new to say that, of course, we can listen to the same thing in various ways. Okay, so you can listen to the song, to the lyrics, try to hear the intention, the emotion, who the singer is. Okay, what strikes us is that when the ontological properties of the object have to be different somehow. For example, if Paulina stands still while she's singing and we hear movement going up and down, that movement is not the movement of the physical source. So the movement, the object that is moving is not cannot be the index, that the cause of the that is singing. And so there are variations in the ontology of auditory experience depending on how we listen. These variations are not just variations, they are actually alternatives, because that's our point, that you can't do all of this at the same time. You can do it in succession and get a sort of general picture that there is this singer singing that song over there. But the way of focusing and the way of entering in relation to that song, there's only one kind, you can make only one kind of object of it at a time. And this is one of the claims that that we end up discussing the most, actually, because, of course, it seems to contradict the idea that, well, brains do many things at once. Why say that there are alternatives here? And also, we have this impression that we listen globally to somebody doing something, and we get this kind of general object, general picture. Why? Where is the alternative in that? Now, perhaps the best way to introduce alternatives in listening, or the most robust finding regarding alternatives in listening is comes from the study of auditory scene segregation, something that I presume is familiar to some of you, maybe not all. So sorry if I'm repeating obvious things, but I'll just give a few details about auditory scene analysis, mainly as studied by Albert Bregman, his early book in the 1994. There have been other studies since. Basically, auditory streams are one level where listening implies alternatives. To achieve a useful representation of its environment, a hearing being needs to segregate parts of the neural input that go together. Now, in theory, this going together should mean that each segregated auditory stream belongs to one coherent sound source in the physical world. This is how Bregman defines one of the definitions that he gives. So I quote now, hopefully you see it on your screen. Sound is created when things of various types happen. The wind blows, an animal scurries through a clearing, the fire burns, a person calls. Acoustic information, therefore, tells us about physical happenings. Many happenings go on at the same time in the world, each one a distinct event. If we are to react to them as distinct, there has to be a level of mental description in which there are separate representations of the individual ones. I refer to the perceptual unit that represents a single happening as an auditory stream. It is useful to reserve, so then he makes a difference. It is useful to reserve the word stream for a perceptual representation and the phrase acoustic event or the word sound for the physical cause. And there are many examples, gives many examples in the book, and there's actually also a CD that was issued coming shortly after the book with examples used in the various experiments. So now I will play back one classic example of auditory stream segregation from that CD, from Bregman's CD.
Demonstration 1. Stream segregation in a cycle of 6 tones. You will hear a cycle consisting of 3 high tones interleaved with 3 low ones. First it is played slowly, then quickly. At the high speed, the high and low tones segregate into separate streams.
Okay. There are many experiments that show that the segregation of auditory streams obeys a principle that Bregman calls exclusive allocation. That principle says that if a piece of sensory evidence, such as a tone, is allocated to one perceptual organization, such as a stream, it cannot at the same moment be allocated to another. Now, there are a few examples actually where this principle seems violated, and Bregman discusses some of them, but generally speaking, the finding is very robust. Most people will hear the alternating tones in the example that we just heard as one line or as two lines, but not as one and two lines at the same time. A related prediction is that if the listener is asked to focus his attention on one stream, he is more likely to miss changes in the other stream. And this is also a very robust observation. Auditory attention is a limited resource, meaning that unattended streams might still be processed, but to a lesser extent. So basically, when you focus on one stream, you miss important changes, significant changes in the other stream, changes that you would not miss if you focused on it, and other such things. Sometimes there have been many metaphors to describe this. One of those that I like is change deafness. So you become deaf to the changes of in the unattended streams. Auditory stream analysis is a primary stage of auditory experience, and so it already entails in itself two kinds of alternatives. Segregate the auditory input in this or that way, and the representation of your auditory scene will change, because there will be one or two or three or four things in the auditory scene. Allocate attention here or there, and features of each object will appear or disappear. These alternatives are not necessarily considered as choices by the listening person, but they are alternatives nevertheless, in the sense that they are either or bifurcations, and they lead to incompatible results. Some of these alternatives can become actual choices on the volitional control. So you can actually control which alternative, where you listen or how you listen. So with a bit of training, for instance, one can also hear two segregated streams when the tones are played slowly. Usually when in the experiment, in the 6-tone experiment, when the tones are played slowly, people hear one melodic line going up and down. But with some training, especially with some priming from playing the two segregated, from playing it fast, then you can, with some training, hear it also as two melodic line interleaves. Conductors in an orchestra learn to isolate and to track even the most inconspicuous instruments of the ensemble. Sound engineers learn to bring to their attentional foreground all the small noises that a voice recording might include, like the breaths, the gasps, the clicks, the pops, things that you might want to leave or not want to leave in the final recording. So there is definitely some training that allows people to choose where they focus their attention and how they segregate things from other things. And this is nothing new. It is perhaps just surprising that attentional allocation and its consequences are absent from many general theories of listening in psycholinguistics and in musicology alike. These theories describe the listener as if the attention was always focused there in one way. They don't discuss this kind of problems that arise from how you allocate and where you allocate and so on. Now, beyond attention, there is at least one other alternative in the process of listening, and it relates to the kind of objects that we listen for. So this is basically, I'm restating something that we said earlier, but hopefully making it a bit clear with some more flesh, example flesh on it. An ontology is basically an answer to the question, what things exist out there? You find ontology in philosophy, in informatics, and in anthropology. It played a significant role for the last 20 or 30 years. What things exist out there? There are many researchers assume that the auditory system as a whole evolved to answer questions of this kind. Auditory scene analysis in particular is often depicted as an attempt to isolate and to track the sources, the sound sources in our environment. That's something that was apparent, for example, in Bregman's quote that I gave a bit earlier. The idea that the auditory system tries to map bits of the auditory input that go together, that tries to link them to sound sources. Now, this seems all reasonable to assume from an evolutionary point of view, because getting information about invisible happenings is an ability that must have given a serious advantage to hearing beings over non-hearing ones. However, it is also true that, well, for the last 1,000 years, there has been much more to human environments than just physical causes. Humans have become highly socialized beings, and they have built complex systems of meanings, of ideas, of interactions. So the kinds of things that they might now listen for are far more diverse than just sound sources. So the core question of ontology, what kind of things exist out there, has become accordingly more complex. A human being has now several ways of answering that question, depending on how it understands the out there. The environment can be about the physical realm of sound sources. It can be about the social environment, its meanings, its hidden intentions. It can be about simulacra, fantastic beings, products of imagination, and possibly other things as well. Now, virtually all the experiments meant to investigate the processes of auditory stream analysis also demonstrate in passing how little role, in fact, the physicality of sound sources has come to play in modern human listening. That is because they all use speakers or headphones. If the listener cared about segregating sounds according to the physical source, as Bregman writes, the most obvious segregation should be that one. The sounds come from the speakers. Instead of an epistemic breach, hearing two auditory streams coming from the same physical cause from the same speaker is just a trivial ability. So trivial indeed that even Bregman doesn't seem to notice it when he comments these experiments. So the fact that already when you hear two segregated streams coming from the same loudspeaker, you are not linking the sounds to a physical cause, because the most obvious physical cause should be that one. So the point is that the depiction of the auditory system that presumes that it evolved in an attempt to locate the sound sources in the environment, that depiction is probably correct. But human environments are now much more complex, and the kind of things that they are made of go far beyond sound sources. So this is why we now have several listening modes, several postures of listening, several ontologies of the auditory experience. Maybe I should skip to the next section. What do you think, Bernd? Because I think we're getting a bit out of time. And
yes.
Maybe.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think the point is should be more or less clear. Also, the problem with the speakers. I hope that you're not now linking too much of what you hear to the speakers that convey it to you, but listening structurally to what we say and actually listen to the content in it. As mentioned before, there are sometimes there are certain suggestions, like in Bregman's example. If it's slow, then it's kind of you hear probably one melody, and if it's played quick, you hear two streams and so on. And maybe the same is true for these postures of listening we're trying to inquire about. That we said, okay, you have the choice to listen in this or that way. And for example, let's stay with this inference of the identity or the inner state. If you're listening to my voice talking, and if I talk in that way, it's my personal way of talking, and it reflects my inner state now. If I talk like this, maybe you'll find out that I'm a bit excited or something like that. So it's my own intonation that suggests that you can infer a state of excitement or of a little bit of sadness or boredom or something like that. This is always linked to me as an individual. There's one way which is very common in the human world. This is the formalization of speech. And like, for example, song. We heard a song before, and song may be one kind of a formalized way of uttering something, that a text. Yeah. If I talk in that way, for example, if I formalize my way of talking, if I talk in that way and you only hear what I say, and it might sound something strange, but you start to listening to it in a way you wouldn't listen before. So then this intonation is not mine anymore. It's not anymore linked to my personal identity. You can't hear if I'm whatever, excited or something. It's abstracted. There is a distance built up from my individual state to the utterance. So by this kind of formalization, if I start fixing pitches and formalizing the pitches of my talking style and the time durations, I rhythmicize it, then I build a distance from my individual utterance to what you can hear. So the suggestion is that this indexical inference of my own personal state from my utterance doesn't make so much sense anymore. Yeah, you can try, and maybe you can hear if I'm more or less excited or something when formalizing my speech or reciting or chanting or something, but usually it's very much hidden. So there is a gap that is opened. Maurice Bloch, an anthropologist, said that ritual speech, meaning this kind of formalized speech in many forms of ritual, this is quite evident. When people start talking or singing or chanting in that way, that this is a reduction of content. Yeah, he says it's reduced because this individual intonation is not there anymore. So it's a kind of a negative it's a negative process. That's in normal talking and everyday talking, there is my own intonation, while in formalized speech, it's absent. So it's something less. However, we have a more positive interpretation of that, because this gap that is created, because my own intonation is absent, so the utterance is devoid of my individual prosody, this can be filled with other emotions or entities or agencies or powers. So this is something which is more commonly in the community defined. Yes. So if I utter in a certain way of melodization, then certain forms or entities or forms of power that are agreed upon in the community enter into this utterance. So in a ritual that you might imagine in a small village or something, and there's whatever initiation ritual, and people start chanting in that way, then you can see that people relate to the utterance in a form of a more communal inference of agency. It's not the prosody of the person like in the Adhan call for prayer. We don't relate to the prosody of the muezzin standing in the minaret, but it's a more communality agreed upon agency, which in that case would be a connection to the divine. And so by certain ways of formalization of the voice through fixing pitches and time durations, we also suggest that listeners would better obtain an enchanted posture of listening. So not try to infer my state of my existence as a person, but rather something else. I play a quick example here. Maybe somebody would know it. This is from a ritual, actually, a singer sounding like that. Okay, this is a formalized way of speech act, because he's saying words, and if you're kind of a member of the community, you will understand. That is him formalizing his speech, but it's still the singer you can focus upon. This guy is singing, and I know him, and he was singing at this time, and formalizing a way so that the address or the content of what he says is getting detached from his person and directed to, in that case, also divine, or let's say spiritual powers. And he is saying that he is calling certain doctors, that the doctors in form of songs, and if the songs arrive, he will sing in that way. So people who are kind of into the community, they instantly recognize by this change of the voice that although you could still infer physically that this guy is the source of the sound, the suggestion is very strong that you should not listen to that in this way, and also not necessarily in which words he says, because the words are coded and twisted and not understandable in a linear sense. So you should try to hear the movement and his quality of voice, which is in the community agreed upon that this is a presence of a spirit being inside of his voice. Yeah. So you can see that you can use different forms of using your voice and thereby suggesting certain postures of listening, which does not still free you of your choice. You can still, if the guy sings like in the last example, you can still connect the utterance to him as a person, as the source of the sound. It's not a problem. You can do that. You can listen to the words and try to understand the lyrics. It's also not a problem, but it's kind of highly suggested to somebody who is into the community to skip that and listen to the presence of the spirit. Yeah, so you can still do the three things, but there are strong suggestions by how you use the voice in order to suggest how to obtain, which posture to obtain. Okay, now we're closing in for the conclusion.
Yes. So the common point between what Bernd just said and what I was saying earlier, to take the get back on the wire, is that basically the shaman singer, or it might sound a bit weird at first, but if you put it in terms of ontology of what exists out there, the singer and the loudspeaker and many other devices or ways of producing sound in our environment, we learn to listen to them as being the mediators of other agencies. So the loudspeaker is perhaps technologically very advanced way of mediating the agency of other beings in sound. The voice is perhaps a very simple and primitive one, historically speaking, but it shows that the way of listening that this way of listening that we're trying to describe, that which is the one that we focus most on, the enchanted listening, is something that might be with us, might have been with us for a very long time. The fact that a voice, something else that we think is so as personal as a voice, that can be very personal, because we can really identify who is talking, who that person is, that voice can also be listened to as impersonating another voice, or as being impersonal, as conveying agencies from other beings, and so on. So this way of listening to something as a mediator channeling the agency of other beings is something that humans have been having for a long time. Enchantment, as we define it, is about listening to auditory streams in disconnection from their physical cause. Freed from their physical sources, the streams tend to behave as if they were animated by autonomous agencies. They seem to obey intrasonic causalities. So some sounds seem to happen because of earlier sounds. That's typically what happens in tension and release, for example, in Western tonal music. You feel that the release has a logical quality because there has been tension built before. Similar examples exist in other traditions, of course, not with tension and release and not with the same kind of musical structures. Listeners also typically feel that sounds have unhearable properties such as color and width. So some sounds appear to have color, some others spatial extension in enchanted listening. And the listeners describe experiences of being moved emotionally or physically by these entities that operate from the sound realm, entities that need not be as personified as the beings of the spirit, as the spirits that Bernd just described, can be things that are much less personal, but still agencies that seem to be located in the sound realm and that are not easily translated into human agencies, to the agency of the musicians, for instance. There are many examples of this, and if you want in the discussion, I can give some. For a kind of wrap-up conclusion, one way to think about this is that enchanted listening, maybe I should make the conclusion short actually, and maybe go over Tia de Nora and go directly to Alfred, to Gel's definition of technology of enchantment, maybe. So there's been basically, what we're going over is several researchers, like sociologist Tia de Nora, philosopher Joel Kruger, who all stated in various ways this idea that music, so we're talking about music really, not about listening, but music and the way we listen to it can be considered a sort of technical device, cognitive technical device, because so stated in different ways, and again, I can go back to the exact quotes. The idea is that music enables us to do things that we could not do otherwise, to do things in ourselves that we could not do otherwise. How we use the word technologies of enchantment is in reference to the works of anthropologist Alfred Gell. Gell coined the term technologies of enchantment to designate technical systems that are not meant to change the outside world, but rather to change how living beings perceived their outside world. So he opposed techniques of production, which is those which have a physical effect on the world, and techniques of enchantment, which change how other beings see their own world. The beings can be other humans or animals. So this is his definition, first definition in an article in 1988. Under this heading, technology of enchantment, I place all those technical strategies, especially art, music, dances, rhetoric, gifts, etc., which human beings employ in order to secure the acquiescence of other people in their intentions or projects. These technical strategies, which are of course practiced reciprocally, exploit innate or derived psychological biases so as to enchant the other person and cause him or her to perceive social reality in a way favorable to the social interests of the enchanter. The manipulation of desire, terror, wonder, cupidity, fantasy, vanity, an inexhaustible list of human passions, offers an equally inexhaustible field for the expression of technical ingenuity. If we think of music as a technology of enchantment, then it clearly has equivalents in other cultures. So it solves the first problem that I was mentioning a bit earlier, the fact that there doesn't seem to be an equivalent to the concept of music. But to be more precise, what all human beings seem to have is not technology of enchantment itself. It's the mode of listening that we associate with what we call music in our culture. This mode of listening that is triggered by techniques, by auditory techniques of enchantment. And that mode of listening might be actually the only thing that is truly universal about music. One may view enchantment optimistically as a cognitive process that enables the listener to latch onto a secure environment, and that would be Tia de Nora's take, for instance, and the take of people involved in music therapy, for instance. On the pessimistic side, one may also describe music as an one may describe enchanted listening, as an avenue for being manipulated by others. And that's more like Gell's idea that artworks and traps are fundamentally alike. In all events, enchantment describes a general kind of goal for this way of listening. People listen that way because it enables them to interact with beings, with feelings, with ideas, which would otherwise be out of reach for them. That's maybe the point of our theory. Why we devised this mode, why we thought that it would be useful to have this kind of thinking about listening is, so first we started from the problem of music, that it has no definition, no cross-cultural definition, and no sound no solid definition also, and also from the fact that there's been a lot of things written about the motivation of music, why people do it, but for various reasons, these attempts to define a function to music are partial or incomplete or unsatisfactory and so on. Maybe the way of listening, the enchanted way of listening, has this property of enabling humans, and maybe it's not so much encountered outside the human realm, I would argue, enchantment. Humans who live in this very abundant environments, which are not made only of physical causes, but of other beings, of intentions, emotions, etc. Enchantment enables a kind of interaction with an environment which is the kind of environment that humans have built for themselves over thousands of years. This mode of listening, which is tentatively universal, has been, to our knowledge, very little studied experimentally. Most experiments focus on indexical listening and structural listening. Can it be studied experimentally? Maybe. Can it be modeled in artificial intelligence, for instance? So is it worth having this kind of goal, this kind of task for artificial intelligence? I ask a question because I know there are many specialists here. We have no answer to it, and we have no answer to many other questions also. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments on this.